It was supposed to be just another segment. Two women, one table, the usual sparring match between left and right. But then Pam Bondi leaned back, smirked, and said something she thought the cameras wouldn't catch. Something cruel, something coded, something meant to humiliate. She didn't know the mic was still on. What happened next wasn't rage. It wasn't shouting. It was 9 words. Calm, deliberate, cutting through the noise like a scalpel through silence. And when AOC said them, America didn't just hear it, America felt it. Within hours, millions were replaying that moment. Not because it was scandalous, but because it was true. Before we begin, a gentle note. This dramatization is fictional. The events, dialogue, and confrontation you're about to witness did not happen exactly this way. But the emotions, the tension, the weight behind every word, that part is real. In a world where mics are always recording, and history never forgets, this is what happens when one woman stands her ground and says exactly what the moment demands. The studio lights hadn't gone live yet, but the room already buzzed with something electric. Not loud, not chaotic, but a quiet, simmering tension that lingered in the air like humidity before a storm. Floor producers whispered into headsets. Stage managers adjusted cue cards and lighting grids. Somewhere in the background, the clink of porcelain mugs and the faint hum of pre-recorded intros looped through the monitors. Tonight's segment had been advertised for days as a civil discussion on reform, 2 perspectives, 1 America. But everyone in the studio knew what that really meant. Ratings. At center stage stood the table. Polished wood, 2 mics, 2 water glasses, and 2 chairs that might as well have been thrones. Pam Bondi arrived first. Blonde, poised, rehearsed, her lipstick perfect, her heels purposeful. She greeted the crew with a bright, southern-tinged smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Where's my good side again, baby?" she asked the camera operator, who pointed to lens 2 with a polite nod. Bondi's assistant rushed over with a powder brush, dabbing her forehead. "You look fierce," she whispered. "I know," Pam replied without looking. She slipped into her seat like she owned the show, smoothing her blazer and glancing at the teleprompter. The producers had already briefed her, but she was used to control. Everything about her, from the tilt of her chin to the curve of her smirk, screamed, "This is my arena." And then AOC walked in. No entourage, no makeup artist fluttering behind her. Just a quiet presence, holding a small leather folder under one arm and a phone in the other. She wore a navy suit, plain, crisp, elegant. No statement necklace, no flashy pins. Her eyes scanned the set once, then twice, as if cataloging the room like an intelligence analyst. She gave a small nod to the stage manager and whispered, "Thanks for having me," then sat. No fanfare, no posturing, but her silence was louder than any opening monologue. A floor producer leaned over both guests. "We go live in 5. Just a reminder, keep it civil, no fireworks, please. Viewers want clarity, not combat." Pam laughed softly. "Of course," she said. "Wouldn't dream of it." AOC didn't speak. She just folded her hands and looked toward the studio wall, where a red on-air light would soon flicker to life. The host entered, gray-haired, authoritative, a relic of the Sunday talk show era. He greeted both women with a neutral smile, but something in his eyes flickered. Perhaps admiration, perhaps calculation, as he shook AOC's hand. Backstage, a young intern clutched a clipboard and stared at the 2 women on camera. "You can already feel it," she murmured. "They're going to clash, but not the way people think." Because here's the thing. AOC wasn't here to perform. She wasn't here to interrupt or insult or trade barbs like a gladiator in a televised arena. She was here to listen, and when needed, to strike. Bondi, on the other hand, had already decided how the night would go. Her talking points were lined up like bullets in a belt. Law and order, open borders, New York chaos. She had rehearsed smirks for every counterpoint, including the one where she'd shake her head and say, "Bless your heart, Congresswoman." She thought this would be easy, but a storm doesn't announce itself with thunder. It builds in pressure, quietly and visibly, until the whole sky shifts. And in a studio where both mics looked identical, neither woman knew that before the night ended, one of them would forget hers was still on, and the other would let silence do what shouting never could. Before the red light blinked to life on the studio camera, before the first question was tossed across the polished desk, something deeper had already been set in motion. This wasn't just a televised debate, it was a confrontation between two Americas. And long before either woman opened her mouth tonight, their stories had already spoken for them. Months earlier, AOC had stood in a processing center near the southern border, just outside El Paso. The air inside the detention facility had been cold, dry, humming with fluorescent light. She wasn't wearing heels or a blazer then, just plain flats, a white shirt, sleeves rolled. Children sat silently behind a chain-link enclosure, their faces blank but their eyes loud. A guard offered her a clip-on visitor badge. She declined. "I'm not visiting," she'd said. "I'm witnessing." She'd crouched beside a girl no older than 10. The child didn't cry. She just asked in Spanish when she could see her mother again. AOC didn't have an answer. She simply said, "You matter," and meant it. That moment wasn't on cable news. There were no cameras in the room, but it changed something in her. The cruelty wasn't theoretical anymore. It wasn't policy. It had a face. Thousands of miles away around that same time, Pam Bondi had leaned comfortably across a Fox News desk. The Quran beneath her read, "Former Florida Attorney General defends family separation." She spoke with conviction, lacquered confidence in every word. "If we don't draw the line," she had said, "we send a message to the world. Break the law and America will reward you." The host nodded. "So it's a deterrent?" "It's justice," Bondi replied, then smiled. They were both women in power, both on screen, but they didn't inhabit the same reality. Bondi saw laws in black and white. AOC saw who got to write them and who was erased by them. To one, the cages were regrettable logistics. To the other, they were engineered trauma. The truth was, tonight's debate had started long before the studio booking. It had started in the homes of viewers watching from two different living rooms. In one, a retired veteran clutched his remote, muttering about order and rules. In another, a grandmother sat beside her daughter-in-law, remembering her own family's immigration story. The fear, the sacrifice, the promise. Two women, two Americas, one stage. But only one of them was walking in carrying the weight of a question that had no teleprompter answer. "What do you say to a child who's been caged in your name?" AOC didn't rehearse her answers because she had lived the questions. And Bondi? She rehearsed them because that's all she had, answers with no soul beneath. As the final seconds ticked down before airtime, the red on-air sign blinked to life. The host straightened his papers, the cameras rolled, and the nation leaned in. No one watching could predict what would come after the commercial break, but those paying attention already knew. This wouldn't be about policy, it would be about truth, and who could live with it. The theme music faded, the lights burned a touch too bright, and just like that, they were live. Two women facing one another across a glossy desk, while millions of Americans leaned closer to their screens. The host's voice was steady, almost soothing, as he introduced the topic: immigration, border enforcement, and the role of moral judgment in lawmaking. Pam Bondi smiled politely, that practiced television smile that walked the line between charm and condescension. She folded her hands like a school teacher about to correct a particularly idealistic student. "Look," she began, tone measured, "we all want to be compassionate, but compassion doesn't mean lawlessness. We can't build policy on feelings. The law must be blind." She turned slightly toward AOC and added with just enough theatrical pause, "Even if that's hard for some people to accept." It was subtle, just sharp enough to sting without breaking decorum. The audience chuckled lightly, just enough to register on mic, not enough to trigger a warning from producers. AOC didn't flinch. She didn't fire back. She simply adjusted her posture, rested her hands on the desk, and waited for the silence to stretch an extra beat before speaking. "When the law is blind," she said softly, "it often means it can't see the people it's crushing." The chuckle died out. The studio fell quiet again, waiting for her to elaborate. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't gesture. She just kept her tone steady, controlled, like a scalpel in the right hands. I represent a district where immigration isn't a theory. It's breakfast tables, bus stops, second jobs. I've seen what happens when we pretend justice is neutral while building systems that never were. Bondi kept her expression neutral, but there was a tightness in her jaw now, the kind that didn't show up on the camera, but buzzed in the room like static. The host interjected, asking about border control. Bondi took the opportunity to double down, her voice rising half a register. If we don't enforce the law, she said, we reward chaos. I mean, what's next? Should we let people skip in line at the DMV just because they feel desperate? She chuckled, offering a glance to the crowd, expecting a laugh line. But it didn't land. AOC leaned in just slightly, not with aggression, but clarity. Immigration isn't the DMV, she replied. It's not a number in a waiting room. It's fleeing gangs, fleeing rape, fleeing hunger. You want to talk about line cutting? Let's talk about which nations cut the line in history and rewrote the rules for everyone else. A pause. A few audience members clapped, quietly, cautiously, no uproar. But the energy shifted. Bondi tilted her head, bemused. You're passionate, she said. But that's the thing about youth. It believes the world runs on feelings, not facts. AOC smiled. Not wide, not warm, but unmistakably real. No, she said. It believes facts are useless without the courage to face them. The audience applauded again. Still polite, still moderate, but deeper this time. Less out of reflex and more out of something else. Recognition, maybe. Nothing explosive. Not yet. But for those paying attention, the spark had landed. The mic was on, and truth was beginning to hum through it. The applause faded. The host smiled for the camera one last time before the red light blinked off. A graphic for an insurance ad rolled silently on the studio monitors. The overhead lights dimmed a few degrees. Everyone in the room exhaled just slightly. The way people do when the performance is paused but not quite over. AOC leaned back in her chair, calm, composed, sipping water. Her eyes didn't wander. She stayed present, not to prove a point, but because presence had always been her power. Pam Bondi, on the other hand, was already performing again, only now for a smaller, more familiar audience. She turned toward the host, her voice lower, casual, that southern lilt sharpening as she spoke. She's one of those girls, she said, rolling her eyes just enough for it to be caught by the floor camera, still idling in preview mode. You give her a mic and suddenly she thinks she's Harriet Tubman. The host laughed, softly, uncomfortably. A laugh meant to disappear behind commercials and applause. Pam smirked, pleased with herself, and leaned in again. God, the self-righteousness. I almost brought a Bible just to see if she'd burst into flames. She chuckled, not loudly, but enough. At the edge of the studio, a young sound technician named Marcus froze. He had been adjusting levels on the audio board, zoning out, thinking about dinner, but now his hands hovered midair. He looked at his screen. The channel was still open. Her mic was still hot. So was the boom above her head. So was the backup lav. He blinked, then turned to the intern seated next to him. A quiet girl named Riley, who had been keeping track of segment notes. She looked up from her laptop, caught Marcus's expression, and whispered, "What did she say?" He didn't answer. He just reached for the digital recorder on the board and tapped save. In the control room, no one said anything. No sirens went off, no alarms. Just a sudden collective stillness. The kind that only comes when something irreversible has just happened and no one is ready to say it aloud. Out on the studio floor, AOC hadn't moved. She didn't flinch. Either she hadn't heard the remark or, more likely, she had chosen not to dignify it. Her gaze was locked on the far wall, where the studio's mission statement was etched in soft gold. Civil conversation, common ground. Somewhere deep in the guts of the building, a server was already archiving the audio. Raw feed, no edits, time-stamped, chain of custody unbroken. The producer returned to the stage. "Back in 30 seconds, folks," he said, cheerful as ever. Bondi dabbed her lipstick. The host straightened his tie. and AOC simply uncrossed her legs, rolled her shoulders, and sat upright. Still water, ready for the second round. No one in the studio audience noticed anything odd. No one watching from home had heard what was said. But the mics had, and sometimes history doesn't wait for the cameras to come back on. Sometimes it records you anyway. The segment ended without incident. The host gave his final nod to the audience, thanked both guests, and the credits rolled over a soft instrumental track. To most viewers, it had been just another political exchange. Sharply worded, yes, but civil, predictable, even forgettable. But in a dimly lit post-production suite 2 floors above the studio, a different narrative was beginning to unravel. Keisha, a junior editor on the late shift, was reviewing the raw feeds for archiving. She had only been at the network for 6 months, fresh out of Howard, barely 24, but her instincts were sharper than most. It was a quiet night, and she almost muted the audio like usual. Almost. But something in the waveform caught her eye. A sudden spike in volume during what was supposed to be a commercial break. She rewound, listened, then rewound again. The moment came like a slap. Bondi's voice unmistakable, laughing. That line, "She thinks she's Harriet Tubman." Keisha froze. Her stomach tightened. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard, unsure what to do next. She had heard things before. Offhand remarks, casual arrogance, the everyday slipstream of politics behind the curtain. But this was different. It wasn't just smug. It was laced with something uglier, something too familiar. The way white women in power had historically belittled black women who dared to speak boldly or simply speak at all. Her heart pounded as she clipped the audio and saved a copy to the shared newsroom server, marked Segment 7, Raw Hot Mic. Then she opened a second window, private, labeled only with initials. She sent the file directly to her executive producer. Subject line, urgent, Bondi mic, review immediately. Then she leaned back, hands trembling. A few seconds passed before her Slack pinged. Exec producer, James, is this verified? She replied with one word, 100%. In the control room, panic spread like electricity. Heads turned, phones rang. The legal team was looped in. The Standards and Ethics Office opened a chat thread before midnight. No one said it aloud, but everyone understood the stakes. A public comment like that on their air with their audio about her wasn't just a controversy. It was a lit match in a dry field. Meanwhile, AOC was already gone. She'd thanked the crew with a quiet nod, declined the car service, and walked out the side entrance with her aide, past a loading dock where a janitor hummed old jazz and offered her a kind smile. She didn't know what had just been caught on mic. She didn't know a clip was already being reviewed in silence, headphones pressed against ears, breath held. All she knew was that the night felt unfinished. Back inside, the host and Bondi remained in the green room, sharing lukewarm wine and half-laugh stories. Bondi was texting. The staff moved with the detached rhythm of people cleaning up a stage, and on a secure company server, one .wav file waited. Its voice wasn't shouting, but it was about to shake the country. It started like most digital wildfires do, not with a bang, but with a whisper someone couldn't ignore. At 9:41 p.m., an anonymous account posted a 17-second audio clip with the caption, "She thought the mic was off. It wasn't. Hashtag Bondi Unmasked." There was no video, just audio. Crackling slightly, studio ambient hum in the background, and then her voice. "She's one of those girls. Give her a mic and she thinks she's Harriet Tubman." A single breath later, the voice laughed. At 9:52 p.m., the clip hit 10,000 views. By 10:07, hashtag, the mic was never off was trending #1 in Washington, D.C. By 10:18, journalists were privately messaging producers for confirmation. By 10:29, it was unstoppable. Political Twitter divided instantly, like a cracked pane of glass. Defenders scrambled to call it taken out of context. Others demanded resignations. But the energy wasn't just outrage, it was recognition. For every viewer who'd ever been talked down to, dismissed behind closed doors, or patronized in the break room, this felt like proof. Not of what Pam Bondi said, but of what they'd always suspected she thought. Meanwhile, in a small black SUV weaving through late-night DC traffic, AOC was scrolling through district updates on her phone when her aide, Javier, glanced down at his screen and swore under his breath. "Alex," he said, his voice low but urgent, "you need to see this." She looked over. He turned the screen to face her. At first, her expression didn't change. She watched the waveform bounce as Bondi's voice filled the cabin, clear and careless. She didn't blink. She didn't flinch. But something shifted in her posture, a stillness that sharpened. The clip ended. The car was silent for a long moment. Javier said nothing. She finally spoke, voice calm. "How long's it been up?" 40 minutes. She nodded. "Then by now they've already clipped it, subtitled it, and stitched it into 3 TikToks and 1,000 reposts?" He hesitated. "What do you want to do?" She didn't answer right away. She turned back to the window. Outside, the city was quiet. The streets empty, the monuments lit, a town that slept through its own scandals until they boiled over. Her fingers tapped the armrest slowly, deliberately. "We don't move yet. Let it breathe. Let them hear her before they hear me." Inside her phone, missed calls stacked. MSNBC, The View, Pod Save America. A text from her mother, simple and sharp. "I heard what she said. I'm proud of how you sat still." The irony wasn't lost on AOC. Bondi had insulted her behind her back, and the entire country had heard it. But she didn't need to yell. She didn't need to fight fire with noise. Because sometimes dignity was louder than any mic. And sometimes history handed you a moment not to seize, but to stand inside and let the truth echo on its own. 2 days later, AOC was home. Not in a green room or a Capitol hallway, but in the thrum and grit of the Bronx, where the buildings breathed old stories and every block still knew your name. The headlines hadn't quieted. If anything, they had sharpened. Bombshell clip. What Bondi said off air, AOC's dignified silence. Who really holds the mic in America? Cable networks debated ethics. Commentators dissected her facial expression like it was evidence in a courtroom. Late-night hosts had already run 4 monologues. Her campaign office above the laundromat buzzed with nervous energy. Phones rang. Volunteers came and went, shuffling takeout containers and printed talking points. Her advisors sat in a loose semicircle, mid-argument. "She should go on CNN," said Maritza, her media consultant. "Strike while the iron's hot. A morning exclusive, maybe with Jake Tapper." No, we go legal," interrupted Jordan, policy director. "We file a formal complaint. Code of conduct, ethics board. Get her cornered." "She's not in office anymore," said Anthony, ever the realist. "It'll look petty." The room turned toward her. AOC sat in the corner, unreadable. She hadn't spoken yet. She hadn't tweeted. She'd made no calls to press, no request for airtime. She just listened, her silence somehow louder than their strategizing. Then without a word she stood. No announcement, no drama. She grabbed her coat and left the office, descending the narrow staircase into the late afternoon light. The streets smelled like sidewalk steam and bakery sugar. Delivery trucks honked. Kids shouted in Spanish from a third-floor window. And somewhere, music floated from a passing car. This was the Bronx that raised her. And in this neighborhood, no one called her Congresswoman. They called her Alex. She turned onto 138th and stepped into her favorite corner bodega. The same one she used to stop at after canvassing. The air inside was warm, stocked with the familiar. Plantain chips, coconut water, a tiny counter cluttered with lotto tickets and memories. She grabbed a ginger ale and brought it to the counter. The woman behind the register, mid-60s, Dominican, eyes like quiet thunder, recognized her instantly. Didn't say hello, just leaned slightly over the counter and whispered, "She didn't mean that mic to stay on." Then a pause. "But I'm glad it did." AOC didn't respond right away. She looked into the woman's face, saw not pity, not anger, but something deeper, validation. That quiet nod older women give younger ones when they know the fight isn't new, only the battlefield. She smiled softly. "Me too," she said. Back outside, the wind had picked up. A siren wailed somewhere down the avenue, followed by laughter on a stoop. Life went on, but something in her spine felt different, anchored. The noise in D.C. would come and go. But this street, this voice, this moment was real. She didn't need a camera crew or a statement drafted in legalese. She needed clarity. And clarity, she realized, wasn't born in the heat of arguments. It came in moments like this. Unscripted, unfiltered. When truth looked you in the eye from behind a bodega counter and reminded you who you were before they put a mic in your hand. That night, the city hummed beneath her window. The quiet buzz of traffic, wind-rattling scaffolding, a far-off bass line pulsing from a passing car. AOC sat cross-legged on her couch, phone face down beside her, headlines still crawling across her thoughts like ticker tape. She hadn't tweeted. She hadn't written a statement. And the silence around her wasn't heavy. It was pregnant. As if the moment hadn't passed, it was still unfolding. She leaned her head back, eyes fixed on the water-stained ceiling above her, and drifted back to a memory she hadn't touched in years. 5th grade, public school in Westchester, a classroom where the bookshelves leaned and the radiator hissed through the winter. She had just turned in a reading response essay, 3 handwritten pages about the bluest eye. Her teacher returned it with red ink scrawled at the top. Ambitious, but where are your citations? Later, in a parent-teacher conference, she'd overheard the teacher say to her mother, "She's a bright girl, but she'll need to work twice as hard to be called half as smart. Not cruel, not loud, just factual, just expected." She hadn't known what that meant at the time, but she felt it. The way you feel cold seep into your coat through seams you didn't know existed. Years later, it would echo again and again, at Harvard forums, in campaign rooms, on House floors, smiles that didn't quite reach the eyes, compliments laced with condescension, headlines that marveled at her audacity to show up, speak up, stay standing. And now this, Bondi's off-mic comment wasn't just personal. It was a distilled version of everything they had ever whispered about women like her. She thinks she's Harriet Tubman, not because of what she said, but because she dared to say anything at all. The question wasn't whether it hurt, it did. The question was what to do with that hurt. Her advisors would tell her to pivot to policy. The media would want a viral clapback. And 100 think pieces were probably already guessing her next move. But none of that mattered if the voice she used wasn't her own. She stood and moved toward her bookshelf, not the one with the awards and framed op-eds, but the little one near the window with the fraying spines. She ran a finger along the row until she found it. Sister Outsider by Audre Lorde. Flipped it open. A passage she'd underlined in college stared back at her. Your silence will not protect you. She closed the book. No drama, no music cue. Just the quiet decision of a woman choosing how to carry her own story. If I speak, she whispered to no one, I won't speak to her. She paused. I'll speak for all the girls like me. The call came mid-morning as sunlight cut through her living room blinds in sharp, slanted lines. AOC had just poured her second coffee, black, no sugar, when her phone lit up with an unfamiliar Manhattan area code. She let it ring twice before answering. Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, said a voice that tried hard to sound calm, polished, controlled. This is Daniel Shore, senior producer from Capitol Forum. I believe you know the program. She said nothing, just waited. There was a pause, too short to be awkward, too long to be confident. We're reaching out because, well, as you're likely aware, a clip surfaced from our last segment. Ms. Bondi's off-air comments, they were not authorized, not reflective of our platform, and we take this matter very seriously. Still, she said nothing. He cleared his throat. Pam has agreed to come back on air tomorrow night to clarify her remarks. She'll issue a statement, contextualize, AOC cut in, voice even. She'll rewrite. The producer chuckled, then realized she wasn't joking. Well, he stumbled, we'd also like to invite you back. Live unedited. You'd have a full segment to respond. Set the record straight. Say whatever you feel is appropriate. Appropriate, she echoed, almost amused. He continued quickly. Of course, we'd be happy to brief you beforehand. Share the rundown. You're welcome to submit prepared remarks or preferred framing. We just want to give you the opportunity. No. Her tone didn't rise, but it landed like a hammer. No. No notes. No script. No rehearsal, she said. Just turn the mic on. There was silence on the other end. He hadn't expected that. He probably had a checklist ready. Potential quotes, camera angles, branded hashtags. None of it would matter now. She ended the call before he could reply. Back in the campaign office, her aides looked up as she walked in. Javier raised an eyebrow. Was that them? She nodded. They want to do damage control, he guessed. They want to make it even, she said. 2 guests, 2 narratives, 2 apologies that don't sound like apologies. What did you tell them? I'll show up. He tilted his head. And, she smiled, and I won't show up small. Later that night, she sat at her desk beneath a modest desk lamp, flipping through a notebook not for answers, but to remind herself that the truth she carried wasn't new. It was older than microphones, older than debates. It came from the kitchen tables of the Bronx, the pages of bell hooks, the silence of the girls in detention centers whose stories were never televised. This wouldn't be about clapping back or reclaiming airtime. It would be about reclaiming dignity in a room that had tried to trade it for sound bites. Tomorrow they would give her a seat, a mic, a camera. And for once, she wouldn't have to raise her voice to be heard. The second broadcast wasn't promoted as a debate. The network called it a clarifying conversation, but the audience knew better. This wasn't just television anymore. It was reckoning disguised as programming. By the time the countdown hit 0, over 6 million people were already watching live. Not through a filter of clips or analysis, but raw, straight from the studio. Split screen, no delay. On the left, Pam Bondi. Her blazer sharp, pearls gleaming, makeup flawless. Her face carried that same calm confidence that had worked so well in courtrooms and cable segments. Cool, polished, performative. She nodded to the camera with just the right amount of contrition, smug but softened by design. On the right, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. No makeup team, no styled hair, no handlers. Just a navy blouse and clear eyes. The lighting didn't hide the small crease beneath her left eye or the faint freckle at the corner of her cheekbone. She had asked them not to adjust a thing. I want to look like someone who didn't come to perform, she told the studio assistant. I came to be present. The host, the same man from the first broadcast, sat between them, digitally and metaphorically. He smiled tightly, voice laced with caution. Congresswoman, we'll begin with you. But AOC didn't speak right away. She tilted her head, slow and deliberate, and leaned toward the mic like it was something sacred. Her eyes never left the camera. No, she said evenly. Let's begin with truth. The words cut through the screen, not because they were loud, but because they were unafraid. The host blinked. Pam shifted slightly in her seat. The control room didn't cut to commercial. The floor director didn't signal to move on, because no one could. The room belonged to her now. AOC didn't gesture. She didn't raise her voice. She let silence do half the work. I'm not here tonight to restore balance, she continued, because there is no balance between mockery and lived experience, between power used to dismiss and the people dismissed by that power. She paused, not for effect, but to let her words catch up with the audience. I was called Harriet Tubman, she said plainly, as if that's a joke, as if being likened to a woman who led people toward freedom is an insult. Maybe that tells us more about who said it than who it was said about. Bondi smiled faintly, blinking, but it was tight now, the kind of smile used to hold a crack in place. I'm not offended, AOC added. I'm reminded. She didn't look at Pam. She didn't need to. Her eyes stayed on the lens, talking directly to the people beyond the screen. Reminded that no matter how far we come, there will always be rooms where some folks feel entitled to measure who deserves a mic. But here's the thing. Truth doesn't wait for permission. The audience in studio was silent. No clapping this time. Just breath held in unison. The host turned awkwardly toward Bondi. Ms. Bondi, would you like to respond? Pam cleared her throat, gathering her polished script. But something had already shifted. Because AOC hadn't spoken at her. She had spoken past her, straight into the homes, the hearts, the histories of everyone who'd ever been dismissed off mic. And now the nation wasn't just watching, it was listening. The host tried to steer the moment forward, his voice moving like a cautious foot across thin ice. Congresswoman, some viewers are asking whether you'd be willing to directly address the remarks in question. AOC didn't hesitate. She didn't break eye contact with the camera. I will, she said. Then came the pause. Not dramatic, deliberate, like the breath you take before crossing a line that can't be uncrossed. She leaned forward just slightly and said, in full clarity, "She's one of those girls. Give her a mic and she thinks she's Harriet Tubman." No emphasis, no mocking tone, just the words as they were returned to sender. The air in the studio thinned. Even through the screen, something in the atmosphere shifted. Millions watching could feel it, the way a storm feels moments before it breaks. AOC let the silence settle. She didn't rush. She let it stretch, daring the audience to sit with the discomfort rather than escape it. Then she added with quiet precision, "That wasn't a mistake. That was a mirror." There was no applause, no gasp, just stillness. She continued, her tone steady, not angry, not bitter, but anchored. It wasn't a fluke. It wasn't off the record. It was off guard. And that's when the truth shows itself. Not when the script is rolling, but when someone forgets they're being watched. Or maybe, she paused, when they're sure they're not. She glanced to her left, not at Pam, but past her, as if acknowledging the space where these words had lived long before microphones ever caught them. These moments aren't new. They're just rarely this loud. And what makes them loud isn't the insult, it's the recognition. Because every woman who's ever been called too much, or too ambitious, or thinks she's someone, heard what I heard that night. She softened her voice, letting the weight deepen rather than rise. And we're tired of pretending we didn't. Pam Bondi sat motionless, lips pressed together, her carefully practiced expression slipping into something brittle. The host, for once, didn't interrupt. AOC closed her statement with something not aimed at rebuttal, but at clarity. "I didn't come here to punish, I came here to reflect. Because words don't vanish when they're whispered. They echo. And sometimes, if we're lucky, the mic stays on long enough for the echo to reach where it needs to." She sat back, calm, measured, complete. No punchline, no final jab. Just truth, laid bare and unflinching. And across millions of homes, viewers didn't cheer. They didn't laugh. They didn't scroll. They listened. The silence lingered longer than the producers would have liked. In any other segment, this would be the moment to pivot, throw to a commercial, cut to a tweet, lighten the mood. But the cameras stayed on, and so did the weight. AOC didn't look at the host, or Bondi, or even the studio. Her gaze stayed steady, locked onto the lens like she was looking directly into the living rooms of the country. "If you've ever been mocked when the world wasn't watching," she said, voice soft but firm, "I see you. If you've ever been the only woman in the room, and they laughed a little too loudly after you spoke, I see you. If someone ever tried to shrink your voice when the mic was off, and your courage when the lights were on, then this moment isn't just mine. It's yours." She didn't blink away the weight. She let it sit in the space like a truth finally allowed to breathe. Bondi shifted in her chair, forced a short laugh, and cut in with a tight smile. "Well, if we're going to start mining every joke for trauma, we'll need a lot more airtime, Congresswoman." The host opened his mouth, ready to intervene, but AOC raised a hand, not to shout, not to point, just to pause the room. She turned her head slightly, finally addressing Bondi for the first time. "This time you don't get to control the mic," she said quietly. "You already had your say." There was no malice in it, no triumph, just finality, like a door being gently but firmly closed. Then she returned to the camera. "I'm not here to drag anyone. I'm not here for the viral moment. I've been viral before. It doesn't fix anything. But I believe in letting people hear themselves. And I believe the mic doesn't belong to the loudest. It belongs to the clearest. And right now, clarity matters more than noise." In the control room, no one moved. The director didn't cue the next segment. The social team didn't post a banner. The producers just watched, stunned, as the moment unfolded without needing polish. AOC leaned back slightly, voice gentle now, almost like a teacher ending class. So to every young woman watching, every kid who's been told she's too bold, too brown, too loud, too much, know this: you are not too much. You are just enough for a world that fears you getting a mic of your own. She nodded once, not a bow, not a signal, just the punctuation of someone who had said what she came to say. And the screen stayed still, because even the network understood there are no commercial breaks in truth. By sunrise the next morning, America had already chosen its breakfast: coffee, toast, and the AOC Bondi broadcast on every screen in sight. Cable news anchors broke down the segment like it was a State of the Union. Screens were split into quadrants, one replaying AOC's "That wasn't a mistake, that was a mirror," another scrolling real-time polls, a third flashing reaction tweets, and the fourth showing a visibly rattled Bondi trying to reclaim her narrative on a different morning show. On Twitter, the clip was already at 12 million views. One user captioned it, "Mic drop without raising her voice. This is how you dismantle arrogance with grace." In newsroom meetings across the country, editors debated headlines. AOC's quiet storm leaves Bondi on the defense. Mike was on, and so was the nation. The power of stillness when AOC didn't flinch. Late-night hosts had a field day, but even they treaded carefully. The joke wasn't AOC. The joke was the fact that Pam Bondi thought no one would hear her say the quiet part out loud. Bondi's PR team scrambled. They released a statement by noon, calling the remark taken out of context and condemning the weaponization of private speech in public discourse. She went on air again later that day and claimed she was being canceled for a moment of levity. But the old playbook didn't land this time, because something had shifted, and not just online. At a radio station in Iowa, an 82-year-old woman called in and said, "I didn't vote for Miss Ocasio-Cortez, but I know dignity when I see it. That other one talked like the rest of them think. She just got caught." In a senior center in Florida, a group of veterans passed around a printout of AOC's quote. One of them underlined the phrase, "Clarity matters more than noise," and taped it to the wall. The backlash Bondi expected never quite arrived, not in the way she knew how to manage. Because this time, the criticism wasn't coming from just the left. It was coming from grandmothers, from retired teachers, from people who didn't use hashtags but mailed letters. One such letter, sent in handwriting that trembled with age but not uncertainty, read, "This isn't about canceling. It's about character. If my generation taught anything, it should have been that words matter, especially when you think no one's listening." Bondi's surrogates tried to pivot, complaining about media bias, woke mobs, and orchestrated outrage. But every attempt fell flat under the weight of one undeniable truth. It wasn't just the words, it was the tone, the smirk, the entitlement. AOC, meanwhile, remained quiet. No interviews, no tweets. Her silence was not retreat, it was strategy. Because when you said something that still echoes the next morning, you don't need to say it again. And so, while pundits scrambled and Bondi spun, the woman who thought she was Harriet Tubman simply went back to work. Committee hearings, district updates, policy drafts. Because she understood what they didn't. Viral fades, but integrity lingers. By the end of the week, the mailroom at AOC's district office was overflowing. Not with angry calls or political threats. Those were old news. What arrived now came in quiet envelopes, faded stamps, and looping cursive ink. There were no press clippings inside, no hashtags scribbled in corners, just letters, handwritten, folded once or twice. Some carried the scent of old perfume, others bore the slight smudge of arthritic hands. AOC sat cross-legged on the office rug, the afternoon sun casting slanted shadows through the blinds as she opened them one by one. Staffers had warned her there were too many to get through in a day. She smiled softly. "Then we read them slow," she said. The first one came from a retired bus driver in Michigan. It read, "I'm 72. I never thought I'd see someone like you speak that truth so calmly. You didn't raise your voice, but you raised all of ours. Thank you for speaking like my daughter wished she could have before she passed." AOC placed the letter down gently, exhaled, and reached for the next. A former public school librarian in Vermont wrote, "You gave me hope that decency still matters. I worked 35 years in schools where little girls like you were told to sit down and let the grown-ups talk. You reminded me why I kept teaching anyway." One envelope had no return address, just a note scribbled on a scrap of lined paper. "They didn't just hear you, we felt you. All of us who were talked down to at conference tables, church committees, union halls. We heard what they thought when they thought no one was listening. And this time someone answered. There was one from a Vietnam veteran in Arizona. I didn't vote for you, still might not, but you stood your ground like someone who's seen a battlefield." Respect one letter, written in trembling blue ink, came from a woman in Georgia who had marched with her mother in 1963. "When she said your name with that tone, I heard the same one they used for Fannie Lou. I'm 83. I didn't think I'd live long enough to see that look answered with dignity. Baby, you did that for all of us." AOC's throat tightened. She rubbed her thumb over the paper like it might preserve the memory better. Some letters came from small towns, others from senior centers, church communities, even a quilting circle that signed their note as the Stubborn Ladies of Marion County. One envelope held a photocopied family photo from the 1970s. On the back, someone had written, "We didn't have a mic, but we raised our kids to know truth when they hear it. Thanks for proving we weren't wrong." There were dozens from teachers, retired, active, substitute. One simply said, "They teach us that silence is golden, but you reminded us that silence can also be complicit, and you broke it, not by shouting, but by showing up." By the time her aide brought tea, AOC was surrounded by paper, each envelope a thread stitching her back to the people she served. Not political operatives, not pundits, but elders, survivors, quiet witnesses who had waited decades to hear someone say, with clarity and no apology, "I see you." She didn't need a poll to know something had landed. The letters said it better than data ever could. As she packed them back into their boxes, carefully, respectfully, she paused on one final envelope. Inside, just one line written in small, careful script. "We heard you, because you refused to shrink." She smiled, folded it back into its envelope, and held it for a moment before placing it on top of the stack. In a world obsessed with volume, she thought, maybe quiet conviction is the loudest sound there is. At first it was subtle. Pam Bondi missed a scheduled appearance on a mid-morning panel show, citing a scheduling conflict. A few days later, her name was quietly dropped from a cable network's promotional flyer for their upcoming policy roundtable. Then came the postponement of her podcast relaunch. The press release had already been drafted, but it never went out. Her team said she was taking a step back to regroup, but no one believed that. They knew what this was. It was the slow, almost polite unraveling of a media persona that had gone too far, too publicly, and finally been caught. Florida donors, especially those with national ambitions, started to pull back. Not dramatically, no harsh words, just less money, less visibility, fewer return calls. A few of them cited messaging discipline in their internal memos. Others didn't bother with a reason. What mattered was this. The phone stopped ringing, not from enemies, but from friends. In Tallahassee, a former political ally went on background to a local reporter. Pam's biggest mistake wasn't what she said. It's that she said it thinking no one would ever hold her accountable. The quote didn't go viral, but it spread in group chats, email threads, and quiet lunches. The network that had hosted the now infamous debate didn't issue a formal apology, but they didn't need to. They let their programming do the talking. Within 2 weeks, Bondi's regular contributor slot had been replaced, not by another personality, but by a rotating hour called Civic Exchange. The show featured teachers, students, local organizers. No spin, no branding, just people talking across lines, not down them. Ratings climbed slowly but steadily, not millions overnight, but enough for advertisers to notice, enough for producers to rethink their formulas. When asked whether Bondi would return, the network offered a standard response. At this time, there are no plans. She tried to fight it at first, released a follow-up statement insisting she had been misinterpreted, that her words were taken out of context in a politically motivated smear campaign. But it didn't gain traction. The moment for defending herself had passed, and she hadn't realized it until it was too late. Because the thing about microphones is this: they don't just amplify what you mean, they reveal what you believe. And what had once been written off as Bondi's sharpness, her edge, now sounded like something else. Entitlement, fragility, mockery in the place of merit. She booked one last appearance, an interview with a smaller, sympathetic podcast. Halfway through, she tried to laugh off the controversy. "It's a shame we live in a world where a private joke can get you crucified." The host nodded, uneasy. She continued, "I mean, people want to compare themselves to historical heroes but can't take a little pushback. That's not courage, that's branding." She smiled, but it didn't land, not in the way she expected. Because by now, the public had seen the other woman, the one who didn't smile, who didn't joke, who didn't strike back in anger, but in clarity. And clarity is hard to argue with, especially when you're offering nothing but noise. By the third week, Bondi's name had mostly fallen off the trending lists, not from resolution, but from irrelevance. She had become the echo of a scandal that no longer needed her voice to keep reverberating. At a political gala in Orlando, she arrived alone, smiled too wide, and left before dessert. In Washington, a junior producer at a national network pitched a follow-up segment. "Where is Pam Bondi now?" The idea was rejected in less than 5 minutes, because no one needed to ask. They already knew. The studio at The View buzzed with a different kind of anticipation that morning. Not the kind that came from celebrity gossip or a viral TikTok challenge. This was heavier, more electric. The producers didn't need to manufacture drama. It was already woven into the air. The audience had arrived early, clutching coffees and clutching opinions. Most of them had watched the segment live. The others had seen the replay, or the clips online, or read the op-eds that now ran from the Washington Post to Reader's Digest. And now they were waiting for her, the woman who didn't raise her voice, but somehow raised the temperature of a nation. When Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez walked on set, the applause wasn't thunderous. It was resonant. Women of every age stood up. Some clapped, others just nodded. One woman in the front row wiped a tear from beneath her glasses before sitting back down. AOC greeted each host with a warm handshake and a steady smile. No flash, no edge. She wore a simple cream blazer, soft gold earrings, no notes in her hands. Just presence. Sunny Hostin wasted no time. "Congresswoman," she began, "millions of Americans watched you respond to an insult with a kind of restraint and grace that, frankly, we don't often see on television anymore. So I want to ask you directly, what gave you the strength to speak without anger?" AOC took a breath, not rushed, not dramatic, just enough to signal she meant to answer honestly. Her voice, when it came, was steady. "Because I wasn't talking to her." She paused. "I was talking to every little girl they told to sit down, every woman who had to swallow a comment at work or in school or at the dinner table, every person who's ever been dismissed with a smirk they weren't supposed to hear." The audience was silent now, listening with the kind of attention usually reserved for sacred things. I knew if I let that moment be about pride or ego, I'd lose the chance to do something bigger with it. Because what Pam Bondi said off mic, that wasn't about me. It was about who I remind her of, and who people like me are never supposed to become. The camera cut briefly to Joy Behar, who nodded with wide eyes. Sunny leaned in. "But weren't you angry?" AOC smiled, softly but with weight. "Of course I was angry, but anger doesn't scare me. What scares me is letting it steal my clarity." She sat up a little straighter. "When you're the first or the only person in a space who looks or sounds like you, people will do anything to make you react. They don't want your ideas. They want your outburst. That way they don't have to engage with the substance of what you're saying. They can just write you off." The audience murmured, a few women clapping instinctively. "So I made a choice. I didn't raise my voice. I raised my standard, and I let her words speak for themselves." Alyssa Farah Griffin, the most conservative of the hosts, cleared her throat. "But doesn't it bother you that you became the target of something so personal, especially from another woman?" AOC nodded slowly. It does. But again, it's not new. A lot of harm has been done in the world by people who smile while they're doing it. And a lot of history has been made by people who didn't shout while they were resisting it. I don't need her apology. What I needed was a mic that didn't turn off and a country ready to listen when it finally stayed on. A quiet beat passed, and then the applause came. Not performative, not perfunctory, but from the place where memory lives. The kind of applause that says, I've been there. I needed that. Thank you. Before the segment ended, Sonny added one last note. Congresswoman, we don't often say this on this show, but that wasn't just a response. That was a lesson, and for once, no one disagreed. Sunday morning in Atlanta, the sun filtered softly through stained glass, casting hues of blue and crimson across the pews. The sanctuary of Bethel Chapel Baptist Church was already half full when the youth pastor, Reverend Malik James, wheeled in the portable screen and dimmed the lights. He wasn't one to bring politics into the pulpit, not overtly, but this wasn't about politics, not anymore. This was about something else, something that had cracked open across the country and hadn't stopped echoing since. As the final notes of the choir faded, he took the microphone and cleared his throat. I want to share something with you all today, he said, not to debate it, but to reflect on it. This came from a woman y'all may know, Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Some of you have probably seen it already. If you haven't, I ask you to just listen. He pressed play. The clip was only a few minutes long. AOC's face filled the screen, steady and calm as she spoke. If you've ever been mocked when the world wasn't watching, I see you. I wasn't talking to her. I was talking to every little girl they told to sit down. This time you don't get to control the mic. You already had your say. She didn't raise her voice, but the sanctuary felt quieter by the second. When the clip ended, there was a silence that didn't ask to be broken. Just a stillness, deep and respectful. It was a kind of reverence usually reserved for scripture. In the back row, Deacon Horace Clay cleared his throat. He had been sitting in that same pew since 1964, since before the Voting Rights Act, since before his own brother was jailed in Selma for refusing to move to the back of a bus. She sounds like Fannie Lou Hamer, he said, voice gravelly but clear. Same spine, same stillness, different century. Heads nodded slowly. A few murmured quiet amends. Near the front, a girl with box braids and chip lavender nail polish raised her hand. Her name was Ava. She was 16, a sophomore at Douglas High, usually quiet, always watching. She sounds like me, she said. And just like that, the distance between generations folded into nothing. Later, they gathered in the fellowship hall for sweet tea and pound cake, and the conversation carried over. Some of the elders remembered being told not to speak up. Some of the youth remembered being told not to speak like her, too direct, too emotional, too loud. But now there was something different, a bridge. Reverend James stood near the serving table, listening more than talking. He knew what had happened. That moment on national television wasn't just a confrontation, it was a transmission, sent from one generation that fought to be heard to another that had been told to wait their turn. And AOC's voice? It had become a kind of tuning fork. It resonated across age, across background, across time. That afternoon, Ava stayed behind to help fold chairs. She worked quietly, then turned to the pastor and asked, "Do you think they'll let her keep the mic?" He smiled gently. "No one lets you keep it," he said. "You just don't put it down." The next Sunday, the clip played again, this time introduced by Deacon Clay. And the Sunday after that, a group of teens volunteered to lead service for the first time in months. What AOC had said on air wasn't new, but for many in that room, it was the first time it had been said that clearly, that calmly, and that publicly. And that changed something. Not everything, but enough to get people talking, enough to get them listening, together. For a few days, the internet was on fire. Clips of AOC's calm dismantling of Bondi's insult were stitched into TikToks, quoted in Instagram captions, and printed on tote bags faster than anyone could predict. But unlike most viral moments, it didn't fizzle into the next headline. It transformed. What began as outrage quietly evolved into something steadier. Organizing. In Cincinnati, a high school speech coach created a community spreadsheet listing free online resources for young women learning to speak in public. In Houston, a community center started a Thursday night series called Claim the Mic, inviting women from all walks of life, nurses, poets, grandmothers, baristas, to share 5 minutes of unfiltered truth. No applause necessary, just presence. But it was in Detroit where the momentum found its name. A group of Black and brown women, educators, and organizers launched a nonprofit under a single hashtag that had been quietly spreading since the broadcast. #MicOn. The mission was simple: train young women, especially those from historically silenced communities, in public speaking, media literacy, and narrative power. Not just to speak louder, but to speak clearer, braver, without waiting for permission. The first session took place in a borrowed library basement. Plastic folding chairs, whiteboard, coffee from someone's grandmother's kitchen. There were 13 women in the room, ranging in age from 15 to 58. The program director, a former youth counselor named Danny, stood at the front, welcoming each woman by name. She didn't start with theory, she started with memory. "Raise your hand," she said, "if you've ever swallowed a sentence because you thought no one would believe it anyway." Every hand went up. That's when AOC walked in. No camera crew, no press release, no social media post announcing her visit. Just her in a canvas tote bag slung over one shoulder, notebook tucked under her arm. She slipped in quietly, found an open seat in the back, and nodded to Danny as if to say, "Don't stop. Pretend I'm not here." And so Danny did. She opened with a clip, not of AOC's now famous response, but of a middle school girl from Milwaukee practicing a speech on housing inequality. The girl's voice cracked midway through. She kept going. "This," Danny said, "is what #MicOn is about. Not just answering insult with elegance, but building the confidence to speak even when your voice shakes." After the exercises, reading aloud, storytelling in pairs, practicing eye contact, there was a closing circle. Each woman shared one sentence they'd been afraid to say out loud before today. "I deserve to be in the room. My accent doesn't make me less intelligent. I've waited too long for someone to call on me. I'm calling on myself now." When it was AOC's turn, she hesitated. "I didn't come here to speak," she said quietly, "but I'll say one thing." She looked around the circle, eyes gentle but sure. "The night I said those 9 words, I wasn't trying to go viral. I was trying to go honest. And now seeing this room, seeing you, reminds me that when we tell the truth, even if our voice trembles, it doesn't just echo, it multiplies." There was no applause, just a deep stillness. Then one woman stood, then another, then another. Later, as the chairs were folded and the lights dimmed, AOC helped pack away water bottles and stack papers. A young woman named Ureli approached her and asked, "How do you know when it's your time to speak?" AOC smiled. "You don't," she said. "You just speak and realize it was your time all along." #MicOn wasn't a trend. It was a turning point, not because AOC had claimed the mic, but because she'd shown a generation how to pick it up and how to hold it steady. A year passed quietly, not in the sense that the world slowed down. It didn't. But in the way that certain moments, no matter how loud they begin, leave behind something still, something steady. By the time the anniversary of the mic came around, most news cycles had long forgotten Pam Bondi. Her name was a footnote in the streaming algorithms, a blip in media retrospectives filed under cultural flashpoints. She'd stepped away from the public eye not with an announcement, but with absence. No farewell, no return. What remained wasn't her silence. It was AOC's and what had followed it. That fall, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was re-elected in a landslide. The district that raised her, the Bronx Queens, had never stopped listening. But now others joined. Volunteers had come from as far as Des Moines and Tucson, citing not just her policy platform, but the way she held the moment. Poll watchers in swing states wore shirts that said, "Truth doesn't need to yell." One campaign sign in a Harlem window read simply, "Mic's still on." She didn't run on what happened. She didn't need to. The moment spoke for itself, and people remembered, not just what she said, but how she chose to say it. 2 weeks after her swearing in, she sat down for a long-form interview with The Atlantic. It wasn't taped in a studio or at the Capitol, but in a small coffee shop near her childhood home. The hum of the espresso machine buzzed behind them. The walls were lined with faded photos of local baseball teams and faded posters about block cleanups. The journalist, a woman in her 40s with a quiet tone and a sharp pen, leaned in after an hour of conversation and asked the inevitable question. "Congresswoman, do you think that moment, the Bondi moment, changed your career?" AOC took a sip of her coffee. No cream, no sugar, just black, the way her father used to drink it. She looked out the window for a second, watching a group of school kids jostle past, backpacks swinging, laughter too loud for 9 a.m. Then she turned back and answered, "It didn't change my career. It reminded me why I chose this fight." The reporter's pen paused. "People think politics is about what you say when the cameras are on," AOC continued. "But I've learned it's really about how you carry yourself when they're supposed to be off. I didn't know that moment would matter as much as it did. I just knew I wasn't going to let someone else define the room, especially not with a smirk and a mic she thought no one could hear." She smiled softly. "That moment didn't make me stronger. It just made it harder for the world to pretend they didn't hear what we've been saying all along." Later that week, the clip from the interview would circulate quietly, not in a firestorm, but in ripples. People would repost the line, "It didn't change my career. It reminded me why I chose this fight," next to images of women in city halls, classrooms, hospital scrubs, campaign trails. One college student wrote in the caption, "I'm not running for office, but I'm walking taller at work now." In the years since it happened, the world hadn't become kinder, but it had become clearer. The noise had quieted, and in its place, something steady had taken root. It turned out all it took was one woman refusing to shout, and a nation finally ready to listen. It was the end of a long day, the kind that started before sunrise with briefings and closed-door meetings and ended with more of the same. The halls of the Capitol were thinning out, the echoes of hurried staffers replaced by the soft hum of vacuums and the muted squeak of janitors' carts rolling across marble. AOC stepped out into the cool evening alone, her coat folded neatly over her arm, her bag slung low across her shoulder. No cameras followed, no reporters flanked the steps. It was quiet, not because nothing mattered, but because some days don't need the spotlight. Some days the walk is the message. She descended the Capitol steps slowly, not rushed, not heavy, just deliberate. The way you walk when you know exactly who you are, and you no longer owe anyone an explanation for it. At the landing, a janitor swept up a pile of leaves carried in by the wind. He was young, maybe early 20s, earbuds tucked loosely under a knit cap. But he noticed her as she approached. He stopped, leaned slightly on his broom, and gave a quiet, almost shy nod. She smiled back, soft but steady. "Evening," she said. He looked around, just them there, and replied, "We heard you." There was no need to clarify what he meant. She stopped, met his eyes, and said simply, "I wasn't whispering." It wasn't a retort, it was a promise. He smiled wide now, eyes lighting up, and then gave her the kind of nod people give when they're not just agreeing, they're standing with you. She continued down the steps. A few aides lingered near the sidewalk, waiting by the car, chatting softly, but she didn't rush to them. She took her time, her shoes clicking softly against the stone, each step its own quiet declaration. Behind her, the dome of the Capitol glowed gold against the night, tall and unmoved. But inside its chambers, something had shifted. Not because of a speech, not because of a vote, but because somewhere along the way, someone had stopped waiting for permission to speak. And when she did, it turned out the room was more ready than anyone thought. The nation didn't change overnight. That wasn't the point. But it had heard. And once a truth is heard, it doesn't go back to sleep. It finds its way into lunch tables, classrooms, Sunday services, union meetings, handwritten letters. It rises through people who once sat back and now lean in, through women who were once called too much and now call each other forward. AOC reached the bottom of the steps and looked back, just once, not for sentiment, but to take stock of the place, of the journey, of the silence that used to swallow voices like hers whole. It didn't anymore, because the mic was still on, and so was she. The night was still, the kind of stillness that doesn't feel empty but earned. AOC walked alone, no cameras trailing her, no flash bulbs, no microphones held up to her face. And yet if someone had been listening closely, they would have heard something just beneath the silence. Not her footsteps, not her breath, but echoes. In the days since the confrontation, the noise had faded. The hashtags slowed. The think pieces stopped churning. Even the critics had grown quiet, unsure of how to spin a moment that refused to be framed as just another skirmish in a never-ending war of words. Because it wasn't just a moment, it was a mirror. And the longer it stood, the more it reflected. Not just Bondi's comment, not just AOC's response, but the question beneath it all: who gets to speak and who gets spoken for? In classrooms across the country, teachers played the clip, not as drama, but as discourse. A history professor in Chicago wrote the words on his whiteboard. That wasn't a mistake. That was a mirror, and asked his students, what does this generation see when it looks into that mirror? In a union meeting in Oakland, a Latina janitor stood up and said she used to avoid speaking at the mic because her accent made people smirk. But now, she brought notes, and the room listened. In Alabama, a black high school student wrote in her college application, I want to study political science because one woman reminded me I don't have to wait for the mic to be handed to me. I can walk up and take it. And in hundreds of homes, no one wrote anything at all. But parents turned to their children or to each other and said softly, did you see her? Did you hear how she said that? That's the thing about truth. It doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't care about ratings. It doesn't wait for a cue. It finds the cracks. It enters the room even when it's unwelcome. And sometimes it arrives through someone calm enough to hold it and clear enough to carry it forward. And when it does, it leaves a question behind. AOC's voice came in softly now. Not to command, not to explain, but to offer. Some people think the mic only works when the light's red. A pause, gentle but deliberate. But history's always recording. Another pause, not dramatic, just necessary. The question is, what will it hear from you? The words lingered like breath on glass. They didn't shout. They didn't need to. They stayed. The next morning, she returned to her routine. Committee hearings, district calls, a visit to a local food bank. She didn't post a clip. She didn't quote herself. She didn't carry the moment like a trophy. She carried it like a thread, woven into the next one. Because the real power wasn't in what happened when the mic was on. It was in what followed when it stayed that way. And far beyond DC, far from the glare of studio lights and Senate chambers, someone sat down in front of a keyboard, or picked up a pen, or raised their hand in a room they once would have shrunk from, and spoke. Not because they were asked, but because they were ready. Because somewhere a woman didn't raise her voice, but raised the floor for everyone who came after. Because sometimes all it takes is one voice that says clearly, confidently, unapologetically, I wasn't whispering. Some moments don't explode, they resonate. This wasn't a story about shouting louder, it was about standing taller. When AOC chose silence over spectacle, clarity over confrontation, she reminded us that power doesn't always wear a podium or demand a mic. Sometimes it simply refuses to shrink. This story wasn't just about a viral moment. It was about what happens after the clip ends, when women speak not to defend themselves, but to represent others, when dignity becomes its own form of defiance, and when the echo of truth reaches far beyond the room it was spoken in. What makes this story meaningful is not that AOC silenced someone, it's that she refused to be silenced, without ever raising her voice. Her calm was not weakness, it was discipline, it was legacy. The mic was never really about volume, it was about visibility. And now it's about what we choose to say when we realize history is listening. So here's a question for you. If the mic were turned to you, what truth would you speak, not just for yourself, but for someone who never got the chance? If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Alexandria Rising Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Alexandria Rising Stories.